The summer of 2003 arrived in Leake County, Mississippi, the way summers always did, slowly, heavily, draped in humidity so thick it pressed against your skin like a warm, wet cloth. The kudzu had already swallowed the fence lines along Highway 16. The cicadas screamed from every tree. And somewhere outside the small town of Carthage, on a gravel road that wound between cotton fields and pine timber tracks, a young woman named Tiffany Ennis, 23 years old, a mother of 2 small children, simply ceased to exist. It was July 14, 2003, a Monday, the kind of Monday that felt like every other Monday in a rural Mississippi summer, unremarkable, slow, ordinary. And then it wasn't. Tiffany's children, a 4-year-old boy named Cody and a 2-year-old girl named Haley, were later found wandering near a dirt road turnoff, barefoot, Haley still clutching a plastic cup. Their mother was gone. The family vehicle, a burgundy 1997 Dodge pickup, was parked at an odd angle near the edge of their rented property, driver's door left open, keys still in the ignition. No signs of forced struggle, no note, no goodbye. Just the open door, the running engine ticking warm in the July heat, and 2 bobbies standing in the red dust, waiting for a mother who would never come back. The question that haunted Leake County for the next 2 decades, the question that deputies whispered in break rooms and family members carried in their chests like stones, was not simply what happened to Tiffany Ennis, but who decided she should disappear, and whether they believed they had gotten away with it forever. To understand what happened to Tiffany Ennis, you have to understand Leake County first. Leake County sits in the geographic heart of Mississippi, roughly 60 miles northeast of Jackson, caught between the Pearl River and the red clay hills of the Choctaw Ridge country. Carthage is the county seat, a town of roughly 4,000 people in 2003, with a courthouse square, a few fast food franchises out on the highway, a Dollar General, and a scattering of churches that outnumbered everything else combined. The economy in 2003 was largely agricultural, timber, cattle, catfish farming, supplemented by whatever manufacturing the region could attract. Unemployment hovered persistently above state averages, which were already among the highest in the nation. People knew each other. People remembered. People talked, but not always to the right people, and not always about the right things. The rural roots outside Carthage were a different world from the courthouse square. Out there, along the unmarked county roads with names like Gunter Road and Stonewall Road, people lived in a patchwork of mobile homes, small frame houses, and timber-framed rentals that sat on leased land or family property passed down informally, without much paperwork. Neighbors might be a quarter mile away. Neighbors might not ask questions. Tiffany Ennis had grown up not far from this world. She was born in 1980, the youngest of 3 siblings, raised primarily by her mother after her parents separated. People who knew her described a young woman with dark eyes that held more intelligence than her circumstances, had always allowed her to use quick with a laugh, devoted to her children in the way that people become devoted when the children are the clearest good thing in their lives. By 2003, Tiffany was living with her partner, Christopher Byard, 31 years old, on a rented 5-acre property off an unnamed county road in the eastern part of Leake County. Christopher worked intermittently in timber and construction. He was known around the area as someone who kept mostly to himself, not unfriendly exactly, but watchful. Quiet in the way that can read as either thoughtful or guarded depending on how well you knew him. The two had been together for roughly 3 years. Cody, the older child, was Christopher's biological son. There were people in the community who later said, carefully, and with the deliberateness of people who had weighed their words for a long time, that the relationship between Tiffany and Christopher had not always been easy. But on the morning of July 14, 2003, none of that surface tension was visible to anyone outside the household. Clears throat. Monday morning in rural Mississippi in July. The temperature had already reached 84 degrees by 8 a.m. Tiffany had been seen at the Piggly Wiggly on Highway 16 the previous Friday, July 11th, buying groceries, both children with her in the cart. Haley balanced on her hip while she reached for a box of cereal. The cashier, a woman named Deborah Horton, would later tell investigators that Tiffany had seemed normal. Tired, maybe, but normal. She had been wearing a yellow tank top and jean shorts. Haley had been reaching for a pack of gum near the register. Tiffany had laughed and moved the gum out of reach. That was the last confirmed sighting of Tiffany Ennis by anyone outside the household. Over the weekend of July 12th and 13th, Christopher Byard later told investigators Tiffany had been home. They had eaten together, watched television. Nothing unusual, he said, nothing he could point to. Monday morning arrived. Christopher said he left the property at approximately 7:15 a.m. to pick up a work order from a timber contractor he occasionally worked with, a man named Earl Simmons, who operated out of a lot on the south end of Carthage. According to Christopher's account, he was gone approximately 2 hours, returning just after 9:30 a.m. When he returned, he said, Tiffany was gone, the truck was running, the children were outside. At 9:47 a.m. on July 14, 2003, Christopher Byard placed a call to the Leake County Sheriff's Office from the landline inside the house. The deputy who took the call noted that Christopher's voice was even, controlled. He described his partner as missing. He described the truck. He described the children being outside alone. The deputy noted, at the bottom of his initial report, a single phrase. Caller exhibited no apparent distress. The swing set in the side yard hung motionless in the dead July air. Haley's plastic cup lay on its side in the red dirt, a thin trickle of whatever had been inside it bleeding into the ground, already drying in the heat. The swing hung still, the toy truck lay on its side. And somewhere, a 23-year-old mother who had laughed about a pack of gum 3 days earlier had vanished as completely as if the Mississippi summer had simply absorbed her. The Leake County Sheriff's Office responded to the call within 20 minutes. 2 patrol vehicles arrived at the property by approximately 10:10. The deputies found exactly what Christopher had described. The burgundy Dodge pickup parked at an irregular angle near the property's front tree line, driver's door open, engine no longer running. The battery had given out at some point during the morning. The 2 children, Cody and Haley, had been taken inside by their father prior to the deputies' arrival. The initial assessment was cautious. Rural Mississippi in 2003 had its share of domestic situations that resolved themselves before they became cases. Deputies asked Christopher the standard questions. Had Tiffany been upset? Had they argued? Was there anyone she might have gone to? Did she have family nearby? Christopher answered each question in the same measured, unhurried tone. No argument. No, she had not seemed upset. Her mother lived over in Atala County, maybe 40 minutes away, but he had not called her yet. He had not called anyone, he said. He had called the sheriff. Detective Ronnie Adcock of the Leake County Sheriff's Office arrived at the property at approximately 11:20 a.m. and began conducting a more thorough assessment of the scene. Adcock had been with the department since 1991 and had worked missing persons calls before, most of which, in his experience, resolved without incident. People left. People came back. People made choices that alarmed their families and then unalarmed them 48 hours later. But something about the arrangement of details at the Byard property, did not settle the way those cases usually did. The truck had been parked at an angle that faced away from the road, toward the tree line at the east end of the property, toward the denser belt of pine timber that ran back from the cleared yard. If Tiffany had been leaving voluntarily, leaving to go somewhere, leaving because she wanted to, you would expect the truck to be pointed toward the road, toward an exit, not toward the trees. Detective Adcock noted this in his report. He also noted the children's bare feet. Both children had been outside without shoes in 90-degree heat, which suggested they had not been dressed or prepared to go anywhere, which in turn suggested that if Tiffany had intended to leave with them, she had not completed that intention, or something had interrupted it. Clears throat. A search of the immediate property was conducted throughout the afternoon of July 14th. 6 deputies walked the perimeter of the 5 acres in overlapping lines. They found no indication of disturbance in the yard itself beyond the truck's positioning. The interior of the truck showed nothing notable, no personal items left behind, though Tiffany's small canvas wallet, which Christopher told deputies she always carried in her back pocket, was not in the truck, not in the house, and not found anywhere on the property. The canvas wallet became the first of 2 details that Christopher offered as evidence of voluntary departure. She would have taken her wallet if she was going somewhere, he told Adcock, when the detective pressed him on it. The second detail he offered was that a single pair of Tiffany's shoes, a pair of white canvas sneakers, was missing from the bedroom closet. Adcock listened to these details. He logged them. He also noted to himself that these were not things a grief-stricken partner typically itemized in the first hours. They were things a person might itemize if they had thought ahead about what a voluntary departure would require. Tiffany's mother, Sandra Ennis, was notified by mid-afternoon on July 14th. She arrived at the property at approximately 3:30 p.m. and stood in the front yard with a look that deputies described, in their notes and years later in interviews, as a kind of locked-in certainty. Not the uncertainty of someone wondering where their daughter had gone, but the certainty of someone who already understood at a level beneath articulation what they were dealing with. Sandra told detectives immediately that Tiffany would not have left her children, not voluntarily, not ever. She said it plainly, without dramatics. She said it the way you say something that is simply, axially true. The search expanded over the following week. The Leake County Sheriff's Office requested assistance from the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. Volunteers, first dozens, then over 100 at the peak, walked grid patterns through the pine timber behind the property and along the creek drainage that ran northeast toward the Pearl River. Search teams with trained tracking dogs worked the timber access roads. Divers were deployed in the creek itself. Nothing was found. The media coverage was modest at first. Local television in Jackson, the Clarion Ledger running a brief item, but it grew as the search continued without result. The story had elements that gave it staying power. The young mother, the small children, the open truck door, the unanswered question. Clears throat. It was during this second week of coverage that the inconsistencies began to surface more clearly. Christopher Byatt had told investigators that he had driven to see Earl Simmons on the morning of July 14th. That drive, from the property on the county road to Simmons's lot on the south end of Carthage, was approximately 14 miles each way. In a 2003 truck on rural Mississippi roads, it was a drive of perhaps 20 to 25 minutes. Christopher said he had left at 7:15 and returned at 9:30, a window of roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes. Earl Simmons, when interviewed, told investigators that Christopher had arrived at his lot at approximately 8:20 a.m. and had stayed perhaps 30 minutes, leaving by 8, 50 at the latest. That was a discrepancy of roughly 70 minutes that Christopher had not accounted for. When pressed on the discrepancy, Christopher revised his account. He had stopped somewhere, he said. He had sat in the truck for a while on a side road. He needed to think, he said. He had been dealing with stress. Detective Adcock drove the route between the Bayard property and Earl Simmons's lot himself. He drove it at posted speed limits. He noted 3 possible stopping points on the route, 2 pull-offs near timber access roads, and a gravel overlook above the creek drainage. He documented all 3. The odometer reading of Christopher's personal vehicle, a 1999 Ford F-150, distinct from the Dodge pickup left at the property, had been noted by the first responding deputy as a matter of routine. A second reading, taken 3 days later, showed a mileage differential that investigators calculated as approximately 43 miles more than the 14-mile round trip to Simmons's lot, even accounting for a stop of 30 or 40 minutes. 43 miles. In a county where the longest through road was barely 20 miles, 43 miles of unaccounted driving was a significant variable. Deputies whispered quietly about it at shift change. Quietly because Christopher had not been charged with anything. Quietly because it was a discrepancy, not proof. Quietly because in 2003, in rural Mississippi, the mechanisms for pressing further, for forensic analysis, for cell tower records, for the kind of molecular evidence that required laboratory infrastructure, were not easily within the reach of a county sheriff's office operating on a constrained budget. Those who knew him said Christopher seemed composed in the days after Tiffany's disappearance. Strikingly composed, some said. He attended community meetings about the search. He sat through interviews with detectives without raising his voice. He accepted condolences from neighbors. He did not cry in any documented public encounter. A neighbor named Ruth Hargrove, whose property adjoined the Bayard parcel to the south, told investigators in the second week of the search that she had heard sounds from the direction of the Bayard property in the early morning hours of July 14th. Before dawn, she said, around 4 or 4:30 a.m. a vehicle. Movement. She had assumed it was Christopher leaving for early work, which he sometimes did. She had not looked out the window. 4:30 a.m. Christopher had told investigators he left at 7:15 a.m. Adcock logged the neighbor's statement. He cross-referenced it with Christopher's account. He put a note in the file that said, "Timeline requires further development." By the end of August 2003, no physical evidence connecting anyone to Tiffany's disappearance had been recovered. No remains had been found. No witnesses had come forward with direct testimony. The Mississippi Bureau of Investigation pulled back its active involvement, leaving the case with the county. The search volunteers stopped coming. The media moved on. The file on Tiffany Ennis was not closed. In Mississippi, missing persons cases are not formally closed, but it moved from the active desk to the shelf, from the shelf to the archive, from the thing detectives talked about to the thing detectives remembered. Detective Adcock, before moving to a different assignment the following year, wrote a final note in the physical file. It read, in its entirety, "Circumstances remain inconsistent with voluntary departure. Subject's whereabouts unresolved. Further investigation warranted." He clipped it to the inside cover of the folder. And then the years began. Time is a strange thing in unsolved cases. From the outside, it can look like stillness, like nothing is happening, like the world has simply accepted the mystery and moved forward. But inside the people most directly connected to that mystery, time does not feel still at all. It feels like pressure, like the slow, constant compression of something that can only hold so long before it changes shape. For Sandra Ennis, The months after July 2003 were a form of sustained waking nightmare that she navigated the way that strong people navigate unbearable things, by keeping moving, by focusing on what could be controlled, by not allowing herself to stop and fully absorb the weight of what had happened. She drove the roads of Leake County herself, in her own car, in the months following the search. She drove the timber access roads. She drove the creek drainage roads. She noted the culverts, the bridges, the places where the forest closed in over the road and reduced visibility to a few yards. She kept a legal pad in her glove compartment. She wrote things down. Sandra filed formal inquiries with the Leake County Sheriff's Office every month for the first year, requesting case updates, requesting to know what was being done. The responses were courteous. They were also thin. There were no new developments to report. In 2004, Christopher Byard left Leake County. He moved first to neighboring Scott County, then, by 2005, to the Jackson metropolitan area, where he found steadier construction work. He had retained custody of Cody. Haley, whose biological father was not Christopher, had been taken in by Sandra Ennis and was being raised by her grandmother. Cody and Haley were separated from each other for the first years. Cody in a house where his mother's absence was, according to people who knew the family, either not discussed or discussed in terms that reinforced a particular version of events, a version in which Tiffany had left, had chosen to go. Haley in a house where her grandmother kept a photograph of Tiffany on the mantel in the living room and spoke her name regularly, deliberately, as though memory were a form of presence. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have sat with the uncomfortable knowledge that the person nearest to you may carry something terrible, the years that followed the disappearance of Tiffany Ennis describe a particular kind of interior suffering. It is not a loud suffering. It is the suffering of the unverified, the unconfirmed, the known but unproven. It lives in the body as tension and in the mind as a low, persistent hum that never fully goes quiet. By 2005, Sandra Ennis had begun working with a victims advocacy organization based in Jackson, the kind of grassroots, volunteer-driven group that emerges when institutional response proves inadequate. Through this organization, she connected with other families of the missing, other cases in rural Mississippi where the evidence was thin and the institutional momentum had stalled. She also, quietly and methodically, began building her own documentation of Christopher Byard's movements and behavior since 2003. She was not conducting an illegal surveillance. She was doing what surviving family members do when institutions have not answered their questions. She was watching, and she was recording, and she was waiting. Clears throat. In 2007, a woman who had been in a relationship with Christopher Byard in Scott County filed a domestic incident report with the Scott County Sheriff's Office. The report described an altercation that had resulted in minor physical injury. Christopher was not prosecuted. The woman later declined to pursue the matter further, but the report existed. It was in the system. Sandra Ennis learned about it through the advocacy network. She forwarded the information to the Leake County Sheriff's Office. She requested that the new sheriff, there had been a change in administration in 2006, review the original case file in light of the new information. The sheriff assigned a deputy to review the file. The deputy reviewed it. He noted the same timeline inconsistencies that Adcock had noted in 2003. He noted the odometer discrepancy. He noted Ruth Hargrove's statement about the 4 a.m. vehicle sounds. He also noted, for the first time in the official record, that no systematic effort had been made to subpoena Christopher Byard's cell phone records for the date of July 14, 2003. In 2003, such subpoenas had been possible but were not routine practice in rural county departments. By 2007, they were more common. The deputy submitted a request to reopen investigative activity on the case. The request was approved. The cell phone records were subpoenaed. They were received. And then they sat, because the deputy who had been assigned to the case was transferred to a different unit, and the records received, logged, filed, were placed in the folder without being fully analyzed. The folder went back to the shelf. Clears throat. By 2010, Cody was 11 years old. He was living with Christopher in the Jackson suburb of Floyd, attending a public school there, participating in Little League baseball, growing into a boy who, by most outward appearances, seemed fine. Teachers described him as quiet, as self-contained, as a child who did not volunteer information about himself. A school counselor at Cody's elementary school noted in 2009 that during a drawing exercise, the kind where children are asked to draw their family, Cody had drawn 3 figures: himself, his father, and a third figure that he initially left unnamed. When the counselor asked who the third figure was, Cody had said, after a long pause, "Someone who went away." The counselor logged the observation in Cody's file. She did not report it to any external authority. Under the circumstances as she understood them, it did not meet the threshold for mandatory reporting. She noted it, filed it, and moved on. But that drawing existed. The 3 figures existed. And the nameless third figure, standing at the edge of the page, drawn in yellow crayon, rendered with the visual grammar of a child who was trying to represent something he could not articulate in words, that figure would come to mean something, years later, in ways the counselor could not have anticipated. For those who have ever noticed a child carrying something they cannot name, a grief too large for their vocabulary, a knowledge that has no shape yet, Cody's drawing in 2009 is one of those moments that, in retrospect, is almost unbearable to look at directly. The marriage between Christopher and the woman he had been seeing in Floyd, a woman named Denise Cartwright, whom he had met through a mutual friend in 2006 and married in 2008, had been deteriorating since 2011. Denise would later describe, in sworn testimony, a marriage characterized by Christopher's emotional inaccessibility, by periods of intense withdrawal, and by what she called a feeling like there was a third person in the house that I was never allowed to ask about. She had asked once in 2010 about Tiffany. Christopher had not raised his voice. He had not become aggressive. He had simply looked at her with an expression she described as empty, like a window with nothing behind it, and had said, "She left. That's done." Denise did not ask again. By 2013, Denise and Christopher were separated. By 2014, their divorce was finalized. Cody, now 15, remained with his father. It was during this period, the 18 months between the separation and the finalization of the divorce, that a series of small but significant events occurred, events that would not become significant until much later, but which, in the backward logic of solved cases, formed the fulcrum on which everything eventually turned. The first event was Denise Cartwright finding, in a storage unit she and Christopher had shared, a box of Christopher's personal items from the pre-2003 period of his life. Among the items in the box was a single photograph, a photograph of Tiffany Ennis, holding infant Cody, seated on the front steps of what appeared to be the Leake County property. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was not Tiffany's, were the words, July 13, 2003. July 13, 2003, the day before Tiffany disappeared. Denise looked at the photograph for a long time. She put it in her purse. She said nothing about it to Christopher. She carried it for 2 years before she knew what to do with it. The second event was Cody, At 15, beginning to ask his father questions that his father did not answer. Not aggressive questions. Not accusatory questions. The questions of a teenager assembling a self from scattered pieces, asking about his mother, asking about what had happened, asking with the particular urgency of adolescence, which does not accept "she left" as a complete sentence. Christopher's responses to these questions were, by Cody's account, uniformly evasive. Tiffany had not been well, Christopher told him. Tiffany had made choices. These were things Cody would understand better when he was older. Cody did not wait until he was older. In 2015, Cody Byard, 16 years old, built like his father but with his mother's dark eyes, called his grandmother Sandra Ennis for the first time in years. He called from a friend's phone, not from his own, which Sandra would later understand was deliberate. He called on a Saturday afternoon in October, and Sandra answered, and there was a pause before either of them spoke. Then Cody said, "I need to tell you something." What Cody Byard told his grandmother Sandra Ennis on that Saturday afternoon in October 2015 was not a confession, and it was not first-hand knowledge in the legal sense of that term. It was something older and stranger and more fragile. It was the accumulated weight of 12 years of living inside a household that held an unspoken thing, finally given the shape of words. Cody told Sandra that he had been told, when he was small, too small to understand fully, old enough to remember, that his mother had gone away. He told her that as he had grown older, he had begun to understand that the story he had been given about his mother's departure did not hold together. He told her that there were things his father had said over the years, in unguarded moments, things that contradicted each other. Things that implied knowledge of his mother's location that a person would not have if she had simply left voluntarily. He told her one specific thing. He told her that in approximately 2012, during an argument between Christopher and Denise that Cody had overheard from his bedroom, his father had said something. Had said it once sharply, in the way that people say things they immediately wish they could take back, that had embedded itself in Cody's memory and had never left. Christopher had said in Cody's account, "She's not coming back. She's not coming back because she can't. Do you understand me? She can't." Sandra Ennis wrote this down on the legal pad she still kept. She wrote it in the careful, controlled handwriting of someone who understood that what they were writing might matter in ways she could not yet see. She then called Mississippi Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Donna Totham, whose name she had been given by the victims' advocacy organization 2 years earlier as the MBI contact responsible for cold cases in the central Mississippi region. Clears throat. Special Agent Totham received Sandra's call on Monday, October 19, 2015. She reviewed the existing case file, the original 2003 investigation, the 2007 partial reinvestigation, the unanalyzed cell phone records, and she did something that had not been done at any prior point in the case's history. She sat down with the complete file from beginning to end for 2 full days, and she built a comprehensive timeline. The timeline revealed the following, among other things: the unanalyzed cell phone records from 2003, subpoenaed in 2007, but never fully examined, showed that Christopher Byard's phone had connected to a cell tower on the morning of July 14, 2003, that was not consistent with the route between the Byard property and Earl Simmons's lot. The tower it had connected to at approximately 5:12 a.m., nearly 2 hours before Christopher's stated departure time of 7:15, was located 4.3 miles northeast of the property, in the direction of the Pearl River drainage. That tower connection lasted 11 minutes. Then the phone went dark. It reconnected at 8:19 a.m. at a tower consistent with the road to Simmons's lot, consistent with Christopher's stated account of his morning, but beginning at 8:19, not at 7:15. Between 5:12 a.m. and 8:19 a.m., 3 hours and 7 minutes, Christopher Byad's cell phone had been off, or had been in an area without coverage, or had been placed somewhere that prevented signal transmission. Special Agent Totham requested a forensic analysis of the cell tower data by the MBI's Digital Forensics Unit. She also contacted the FBI's field office in Jackson, requesting assistance with geographic analysis of the Pearl River drainage terrain northeast of the Byad property. On March 3, 2016, a joint MBI-FBI search team deployed to a section of the Pearl River drainage area, 4.1 miles northeast of the former Byad property. Selected based on the cell tower data and on satellite imagery analysis that identified several locations where the terrain showed evidence of prior disturbance consistent with the 2003 timeframe. The search took 11 days. On March 14, 2016, at approximately 2:47 p.m., a member of the search team located partial human remains in a heavily forested area approximately 40 meters from a timber access road, in a depression that had been partially obscured by nearly 13 years of vegetation growth and sediment accumulation. The remains were recovered and transported to the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office in Pearl, Mississippi. Forensic dental comparison conducted against Tiffany Ennis's dental records, which Sandra had preserved and provided to investigators, confirmed the identification on April 7, 2016. The remains were those of Tiffany Ennis. She was 23 years old when she disappeared. She had been in the ground for 12 years and 8 months. Clears throat. The forensic examination of the remains was conducted over a period of 6 weeks by the State Medical Examiner's Office in cooperation with a forensic anthropologist from the University of Mississippi Medical Center. The examination was limited by the advanced decomposition and the effects of the environment over 13 years. However, the examination produced findings that the medical examiner described as significant. The findings, which were included in a sealed forensic report prepared for prosecutorial use, contained observations regarding the position and characteristics of the remains that the medical examiner stated were, in their professional opinion, inconsistent with accidental death or voluntary environmental exposure. The investigation moved from the cold case unit to active homicide status. Special Agent Totham, in coordination with the Leake County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office for the 5th Circuit Court District of Mississippi, began building the case for prosecution. Denise Cartwright was interviewed. She provided the photograph, the one dated July 13, 2003, and provided a sworn statement regarding Christopher's comment during their 2012 argument. She had been carrying both of those things for years. She had carried them the way people carry things they don't know how to put down, with great effort, with growing cost, with the quiet, grinding exhaustion of someone waiting for the moment when the weight could finally be transferred to someone equipped to receive it. Cody Byad, now 17, was interviewed in a forensic interview setting with a trained child forensic interviewer. Despite being close to legal adulthood, the investigators exercised this extra caution deliberately, understanding the sensitivity of what they were asking him to provide and the position it placed him in. Cody answered every question. His account was consistent across multiple interviews conducted over several months. Ruth Hargrove, now in her early 70s, still living on the adjoining property, still as clear in her recollections as she had been in 2003, was re-interviewed. She confirmed her original account of the early morning vehicle sounds on July 14, 2003. She added one detail she had not provided in 2003. She had looked out the window briefly that morning, and she had seen what she believed was Christopher's F-150 returning to the property from the northeast direction, from the direction of the Timber Access Road, in the gray pre-dawn light, at approximately 5:45 a.m. She had not mentioned this in 2003, she told investigators, because at the time she had not understood its significance. She had not known about the cell tower data. She had not known what she had seen. She knew now. Clears throat. On September 22, 2016, a Leake County grand jury returned an indictment against Christopher Aaron Byad, then 44 years old, for the first-degree homicide of Tiffany Ennis. The arrest was made at Christopher's residence in Floyd, Rankin County, at approximately 6:15 a.m. on September 23, 2016. Special Agent Totham was present, along with 4 MBI agents and 2 Rankin County Sheriff's deputies who assisted with the warrant service. Christopher Byad was standing in the kitchen of his house when the agents entered. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. He had a cup of coffee in his hand. He set the coffee down on the counter, carefully, precisely, as though there were all the time in the world, and he looked at Special Agent Totham for a long moment before she told him he was under arrest. Then he looked at the floor. He said nothing. He was handcuffed and walked to a waiting vehicle. He did not resist. He did not speak. Neighbors later described standing in their driveways in the early morning light, watching the official vehicles leave, not fully understanding what they were seeing. By noon that day, the arrest had been reported by Jackson television stations. By evening, it had been picked up by the Associated Press wire. By the following morning, the story was running in the Clarion Ledger, in regional news outlets across the Southeast, and in national missing persons advocacy publications that had followed the case intermittently since 2003. The community reaction in Leake County and in Floyd was a complex, layered thing. The kind of reaction that only happens when an arrest involves someone who has lived among people for years, who has been present at community events and school functions and church gatherings, who has been a neighbor and a coworker and a parent in the ordinary, daily sense of those words. There were people who said, immediately and without hesitation, that they had always known, that they had always felt something was wrong, that the composure, the control, the way he had answered questions in 2003 had never sat right with them, and that they had carried their discomfort for 13 years like a low-grade fever that the news of the arrest had finally broken. There were also people, fewer but present, who expressed shock, genuine or performed, and who recalled Christopher as a decent man, a hard worker, someone they had never doubted. These responses, too, are part of the record. They are part of the human geography of the case, the reminders that proximity does not equal knowledge, and that the people who seem least capable of terrible things are sometimes precisely the ones capable of them. Sandra Ennis was at her home in Attala County when her phone rang with the news of the arrest. She had been preparing breakfast. She was told by a member of the investigative team, as a courtesy, before the news went public. She sat down at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand for what she described as a very long time. She did not cry immediately. She stared at the surface of the table. Then she looked at the photograph of Tiffany on her mantle, the same photograph that had been there since 2003, the one Sandra had kept in place through all the years of silence, all the years of unanswered questions, and she spoke to it. She told investigators later in the straightforward way she told them everything that she had said. I told them from the beginning. Clears throat. The case of State of Mississippi v. Christopher Aaron Byard proceeded through the Fifth Circuit Court District over the following year. Christopher entered a plea of not guilty at his arraignment in October 2016. Defense attorneys filed multiple pretrial motions challenging the cell tower evidence and the circumstances of the forensic examination of the remains. All motions were denied. The trial was scheduled for and commenced in September 2017 in Leake County Circuit Court before Judge Thomas Rayner. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Stephen Doyle and his assistant, Lisa Marie Perkins. The trial lasted 11 days. On the fourth day of the trial, Cody Byard, now 18 years old, legally an adult, seated in the witness stand in the same county where his mother had disappeared when he was 4, testified before a packed courtroom. He answered every question. His voice was steady. He described, in precise and careful language, what he had heard in 2012. He described the years of questions that had gone unanswered. He described what it had meant to grow up in a house where the name of his mother was managed rather than mourned. When the district attorney asked Cody to describe, in his own words, what he believed had happened to his mother, defense attorneys objected on the grounds of speculation. The objection was sustained. But Cody had already looked at the jury, and the jury had looked back at him. On September 29, 2017, after deliberating for 7 hours and 40 minutes, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Christopher Aaron Byard stood in the courtroom as the verdict was read. His expression did not change. He looked at neither the jury nor the gallery. He looked at a point slightly above the level of the judge's bench, fixed, still, the way he had always been still, and he accepted the verdict in the same silence in which he had committed the act that the verdict now named. He was sentenced on November 14, 2017, to life in the Mississippi Department of Corrections without the possibility of parole. As the court officers moved to escort Christopher Byard from the courtroom, Sandra Ennis, seated in the front row of the gallery, watched him pass. People who were in the courtroom that day described her expression as one of profound and exhausted calm, not triumph, not relief in any simple sense, but the expression of someone who had finally, after 14 years, been allowed to put something down. The courtroom door closed behind Christopher Byard. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone in the back row began to cry, quietly, and the sound of it moved through the gallery like the first breath after a long-held silence. There is a particular quality to the justice that comes late. It does not erase the years. It does not return what was taken. It does not undo the mornings that Sandra Ennis drove the county roads with a legal pad in her glove compartment, or the years that Haley grew up in a house with a photograph on the mantel instead of a mother, or the 11 days that a search team walked a Pearl River drainage in the cold of March, looking for what should never have been there to find. Late justice does not give back time. What it gives is something narrower and more precise. It gives the truth an official name. Tiffany Ennis was 23 years old. She had dark eyes. She laughed about a pack of gum near a grocery store register 3 days before she was taken. She had a 4-year-old who drew a yellow figure at the edge of a page and called it someone who went away. She had a mother who never stopped driving the roads. She had a daughter who grew up knowing her face from a photograph on a mantel. She was a daughter and a mother and a person whose life had value independent of every institutional failure and every passing year and every moment in which the case file sat on a shelf, while the man who had ended her life went on living his. She deserved better. She deserved faster. She deserved the full force of every mechanism available. What she got, eventually, imperfectly, incompletely late, was the truth spoken in a courtroom on a September afternoon in Leake County, Mississippi, and a jury of 12 people who looked at the evidence, and at her son's steady eyes and said, "We know what happened here." That is not nothing. It is, in the terrible arithmetic of cases like this one, something. Clears throat. For every Tiffany Ennis whose case file is still on a shelf somewhere, for every family still driving the back roads, still writing things down on legal pads, still waiting, this story is for them. She was here, she mattered, she was not forgotten.